this is Josh Lewis. Today I'm interviewing Joe Baumgartner. It's August 4th, 2013. We're in Washington, D.C. at his home. This interview is part of the D.C. Oral History Project sponsored by the Neighborhood Farm Initiative and the D.C. Humanities Council. Joe, thanks a lot for having me.
Well, thank you for coming.
All right. Could you start just by sharing your name and address for us?
I'm Joe Baumgartner, 3601 Connecticut Avenue, apartment 505, Washington, D.C.
Thanks. So let's start from the very beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in a little town called Elkton, Kentucky.
Okay.
And then when I was not less than a year old, we moved to Minneapolis for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved back to Kentucky, and that's where I ended up growing up the rest of my life and going to college. And then I came to D.C. after college.
All right. So who did you grow up with? Were you your only child? Did you have any brothers and sisters?
I have two younger brothers, David and Chris,
Mm.
and my parents owned a tobacco farm. So and we also had gardens, and both my grandparents had gardens. So
Wow.
that was sort of how I was introduced to gardening. And
So is that kind of what your parents did from income? Mostly was the tobacco farm?
no, it was a supplement to the income.
Okay.
Unless you were really a big farmer, my parents only had like 100 acres,
Mm-hmm.
so it was not enough to really make a living off of.
Yeah.
But tobacco supplemented the income. And now it's different now because of the whole reorganization of the tobacco under the Clinton administration. So there are very few tobacco farms left.
Hmm. Did you used to help out a lot or a little bit? Or?
Oh, a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, tobacco is very hands-on.
Yeah.
It's a lot of handwork. It's not, it's worse than a vegetable garden.
So what kind of stuff did you do growing up with the tobacco farm?
Well, you'd have to set up what they called a plant bed, which is you would gas the ground so nothing would grow, and then you would put seeds down for tobacco plants.
Mm-hmm.
And once they were a certain size, then you would pull them up, and there was a machine that you would put the plants in, and it would plant them in the rows.
Hmm.
And then after you had to keep it hoed, you had to pull weeds, cultivate, and then you also had to take the flowers and things off at a certain point so that the leaves would get thick and it wouldn't be for a better quality leaf. So
Yeah.
we did that and spraying, and then you had to cut it all by hand and had to put it on sticks and put it up to dry. And so like I said, it was very...
That's the whole process.
And then at the end, after it was dried, you had to pick all the leaves off. And yeah, it was...
Were there different types of tobacco, or was it just this?
We had two types. One was what they called dark, and one was burley. And burley, I believe, was used for cigarettes, and dark was more for cigars. But my grandparents also grew one where you had to smoke it. So in order to dry it out, you had to put it in a barn and then smoke it like you would meat.
Okay.
So when you would drive around where in certain times of the year you'd see smoke coming out of barns, the barns weren't on fire. It was
Smoking
the
tobacco.
wood burning to dry the tobacco out.
Yeah.
But like I said, it's not really there much anymore. It's with the whole Clinton administration reorganization, most of the tobacco moved to Brazil.
Hmm.
So a lot of people who are near or just above the poverty level now are down at the poverty level because they don't have the tobacco anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Though you think of it as something nasty, and
Mm.
it really did provide some income for people who really
Yeah.
needed it. So sort of sad, but
Yeah. So how old did you say you were when you moved back from Minnesota?
I was 5, and I guess we got the farm when I was 6 or 7.
Mm-hmm.
We got the farm, so and my parents still have the farm, so.
Yeah.
But they don't really grow much anymore, just some corn and soybeans.
So what do you remember? Do you remember the garden growing up? The vegetable garden that you had as a child in Kentucky?
In Kentucky, yeah, we always had tomatoes and squash and cucumbers and my mother would can and freeze and do all of that. And then I remember my grandmother's garden in Minnesota with all the, I was always surprised she could do lettuce and peas and stuff throughout the year because the heat wasn't there, and we could never do that in Kentucky.
Yeah.
You know, peas were an early spring thing
Yeah.
or a fall thing because the heat would just take them away. And then I remember my grandmother in Kentucky too having a garden. And the one thing I remember about hers is she always planted corn with pole beans. So she'd plant the bean and the corn together so it would grow up the.
Okay.
So she didn't have to do like we do in the garden and stake her beans and stuff.
Yeah.
She would plant the two together so the bean would grow up the corn plant.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
So were you're in Kentucky? Were you kind of out in the more, was it more rural or urban setting?
We were in western Kentucky, so it was much more an agricultural area. There was some industry, but where my grandmother was, there was no industry at all. It was purely agriculture and, you know, little towns with like the doctor's offices and the lawyers and the tradespeople in the stores, but there really was no industry at all in the whole county.
So most of the people in your community, they just, there was a whole culture of everyone was somehow involved in growing food or growing some type of crops or something like that.
Yeah, the crops mainly were corn, soybeans, and tobacco. And then there were a few little specialized growers. There were some people who grew ginseng, and then there were people who grew potatoes. And then there were, we really didn't have the vegetable markets, but we had some orchards. There were quite a few people who had orchards. Yeah. And so, but now the vegetable, you know, with the farmer's market and stuff, they have that much more than they had back then.
Yeah. Do you remember where you used, like in Kentucky, where we used to get things like seeds, or do you remember if there was like seed stores? Or
we always got them at Norse's Hardware that had been there since the 1800s.
Wow.
It was like the oldest business in town, but that's where we always got our seeds and our slips. We called them slips. People, I think, now call them plants, but we always called them slips. Or sometimes we would get seeds and tomato plants and stuff. You could go on the plant bed with the tobacco because it was and so you could get your plants started, because also with the beds, they were covered in like a cheesecloth, so it kept it warmer. So you could start your tomato plants really early outside.
Okay.
And just leave them there. Sometimes we did that. Sometimes we went to Norse's. It depended.
So it's the cheesecloth is just similar to what is the kind of material that most people use? I usually see people cover their rows with some type of white, kind of see-through stuff.
Yeah, it's a white see-through, but this was heavier than that. It was made out of cotton, and it almost was like a light cotton cloth. And you could only use it once because, you know, after being out in the elements and stuff, it would tear, it would disintegrate. I mean, because you would also have to anchor it down with wire. And so where it touched the ground, it would have little gauntlets for little metal rings. But, you know, that would all rot away once it was there a month or two, because it just got, well, with nature, you know, it just disintegrated.
The elements.
Yeah, the elements just took a toll on it. So after a year, you couldn't use it again. But the stuff they use now, I don't know that disintegrates at all. It almost feels like a man-made fiber or something.
I think so.
Yeah.
So in your garden in Kentucky, I know you said you used some type of sprays on the tobacco and things. What approach did you have? Did you kind of spray the vegetable garden too with certain things, or was it more of an organic thing? Or?
The only thing we used on the vegetable garden was Seven 7, which is a white powdery stuff, and I don't know how harmful that is. Or I know in Melvin Hazen we can't use anything like that. But that's all we used. We didn't use, the tobacco sprays were much more harsh. You know, they were mainly for caterpillars and grasshoppers and stuff, but you would use a harsher chemical. But yeah, in the garden we only used Sevin 7, and that was it.
Yeah. So, sounds like you guys probably grew, I mean, a lot of your food, but when you did have to buy stuff, do you remember certain grocery stores or markets or places where you went in Kentucky?
Yeah, we only had like a grocery store, a chain called Sureway
Mm.
in Western Kentucky, and that's where we went. There was that and IGA, and that was basically your choice. There was not a lot there.
Yeah.
You know, there wasn't a lot to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
But now, of course, they have Walmart, and I think Kroger's has moved in. And,
Okay.
you know, we didn't have anything like that.
Yeah. So, you said that you lived in Kentucky up until you went to college?
I
was
went to
it, or-
college. I went to college in Kentucky, and then I left. I got a job in D.C., so that's why I came here.
Right out of college. What year was that you came to D.C.?
I came to D.C. in January of '88.
88. Okay. All right. What neighborhood did you move to?
I moved to Forest Hills, and I only lived there like a year or so. And then I had a friend who was redoing a townhouse on Capitol Hill, so I moved there. And when I was there, I had a few little strawberries and a few little things I tried to plant because, you know, with a townhouse, you don't get much of a yard.
Yeah.
And then I moved to the waterfront and had a balcony, and I did grow tomatoes and stuff out on the balcony. And then I moved up to Northwest, down the street, where I lived for 14 years.
Mm.
And that's when I got my garden at Melvin Hazen,
Okay.
like a year or two after I moved in there.
All right. So, what do you kind of remember? Do you have any memories of what it was like when you first moved to DC? What the neighborhood was like? Things that kind of stood out to you from when you first got here?
I remember there being a lot of old people,
Yeah.
very old people.
Yeah.
I think the neighborhood's changed that way. It's
Mm-hmm.
not quite as old as it used to be, or maybe I'm just more in the
Yeah.
older category, so I don't realize it's
Yeah.
the same. But I remember there being lots of trees in DC and lots of green space, and that's what I remember. And snow. There was a lot of snow when I first moved to DC, much more than we had. I was used to ice.
Yeah.
I wasn't used to having a lot of snow, but
Yeah.
a lot of ice.
Yeah.
So that was a little different. So.
Okay. So it sounds like as soon as you got here, you were kind of looking for some way to start growing something. I mean.
Yeah, I did. Because like I said, I had my little space on Capitol Hill, my balcony, and then once I moved to Cleveland Park, then I got a garden plot.
Yeah.
Probably, I signed up, and I think I was on the list for maybe a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
But I know the list is much longer now.
Yeah.
Apparently, it's much longer.
Yeah.
But when I get there, it was like 2 years was the average
Mm-hmm.
wait. And I ended up getting a plot from a lady who had bone cancer.
Mm.
And she wasn't able to take care of it. So I think I got the plot in June or July.
Yeah.
And it was a mess. And I cleaned it up, and I've had the plot ever since. Unfortunately, the lady died.
Yeah.
But I've had the plot ever since, and I've been there for at least 15 years.
Okay. So the late 90s.
Late 90s, I would have gotten the plot, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was very lucky. The soil was very good. There was no clay.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep putting organic matter back in so I don't get the clay, because I know if I don't
Yeah.
keep it up, I know the clay will come back.
It's gonna rob the nutrients.
And yeah, and rob the nutrients, and plus, you know, and I do the dig-in method,
Mm-hmm.
where you take your peelings and things from the kitchen, and you just dig a hole and dig them in the garden.
Yeah.
I think the compost bins is it just takes up a lot of space.
Yeah. I think Jerry Seidel was saying she buries her weeds and stuff. Too.
Yeah,
She
and the
was
weeds
telling
and stuff. The only thing I won't dig in is tomatoes or anything dealing with tomato plants. I take all that stuff away
me. Yeah.
because I'm always afraid of disease
Mm-hmm.
with those items.
Yeah. So in 1988 when you moved to DC, where do you remember some of the restaurants or anything that you used to like to go to that maybe might not be around anymore? Or
I don't remember that, but I do remember Marvelous Market opening.
mm-hmm.
And it was just down the street, and I remember being thrilled with Marvelous Market,
All right.
which now is, and then I remember it grew and grew, and then it shrank back
Where's
again.
Marvelous Market?
It is near Connecticut and Nebraska,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they have one in Tinleytown now too. But there was a time when they were starting to go all over the city, and I think they got a little too big, and then they shrank back to. But I remember going to Marvelous Market.
What was so exciting about Marvelous Market?
The bread was just great.
Yeah.
And there was a little market on Connecticut and Nebraska called the Cloverleaf, and I don't know if it's still there or not.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember them having chickens that had never been frozen, which I had never seen before in my life,
Mm-hmm.
being from Kentucky, unless you got it from the farm,
Yeah.
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 But they had a big counter and case with chickens on ice,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember that being a little unusual.
Yeah. Were there any farmers markets or anything that you remember from your first early days in DC?
Only Eastern Market was all I knew about.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go there sometimes on Saturday morning when I lived on Capitol Hill, or even on the waterfront.
Yeah.
I would go there, and so and that was nice. I liked Eastern Market, and sometimes during the week I would go too. There were certain vendors I knew were there during the week, and so certain days of the week, if I needed something, I would stop by.
Who were some of your favorite vendors?
I don't know her name, but it was a little old lady and her son, and their produce was always great.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the things, she always had sweet potatoes that looked like hell. But sweet potatoes, you could tell she had taken and aged them before,
Mm-hmm.
Because sweet potatoes you don't dig up and eat.
Eat right
You-
away.
Yeah, you let them set a while,
Mhm.
and you could tell that's why they look like hell, because they've
Mhm.
been setting a while. And so I always made sure if I got sweet potatoes, I got them from her because I knew
Yeah.
she took the time to let them set outside and cure before she sold them.
Yeah.
Not like the things you get at Giant, which you have to take home and let set yourself for a few,
Yeah.
a week or two before you eat them.
Yeah.
Because I don't think people know what sweet potatoes are really supposed to be. Because I think they get them from Giant and cook them, which is not,
Yeah.
in my opinion, that's not how you do sweet potatoes.
Well, I think there's a few things like that. I mean, like most people don't eat bananas when they're fully ripe, or like people buy the avocados when they're real hard. Like,
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know. Sometimes I don't know if that's like the shipping, the business side of it, or
When it
people's
arrives,
just ignorance. Yeah, I don't know.
But anyways, that's what I remember, that I could always get good sweet potatoes from her.
Yeah.
Like I would get from home, not from Giant.
Yeah. All right. So, you moved around a few different places in DC before you settled in this neighborhood.
I did. Because I lived in, I guess it was Northeast and Southwest before I really settled here.
Yeah.
Um,
Were any of your neighbors had a green thumb like you in the other neighborhoods you lived in? Do you remember any people that were also growing food?
Not really. And in those days too, I was very, very young and not really paying attention to those sort of things.
Mhm.
I was just, like I said, I was young and just sort of, out of college and thinking about career and looking for the next job and,
Mhm.
those sort of things. I
Yeah.
really didn't. I was much more career focused, I think, at
Mhm.
that point in my life.
Yeah.
But it was good when I did get the garden because it gave me time away just to think and sort of, and out of the office atmosphere and out of the,
Yeah, it's therapeutic.
It's
definitely,
therapeutic.
Yeah.
It gave me time to think and really
Mhm.
think about life more and other things,
Yeah. Connect more to earth.
and slow down,
Mhm. Yeah,
Slow down.
patience
and patience
yeah.
and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And it just being outside for an hour, really does help.
Yeah, yeah. So you got your plot in the late '90s, just before Y2K or something like that.
Yeah, probably like, I would think it would have been around 97,
Oh,
something like
okay.
that.
All right. So, and did you remember the lady's name that passed away, whose plot it was?
I don't remember her name, but she had been there for years.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the garden operates is if you can't take care of your plot for some reason,
Yeah.
we have what they call tenant farmers. So somebody will come in for a year and take care of the plot,
Wow.
and when you're able to, you can come back to your plot.
Wow.
And it's somebody on the waiting list, and it just happened. My name was picked to be the tenant.
All right.
And if she had gotten well, of course, I would have had to give the plot back, but she didn't, unfortunately. But it also helps ensure the garden stays continuously productive, because you don't want a plot, if somebody has to have, say, back surgery or something,
Mm-hmm.
or is pregnant with a child, you don't want that plot to just sit there for a year and get weeds and,
Mm-hmm.
So it's one way the garden has found to sort of introduce people to the garden, but also keep the plots going.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because it kind of gives the gardeners a chance to give someone an opportunity to really see how well they might fit in.
Exactly, and they may
garden.
decide they don't want a plot after the
Yeah.
first year, after they figure out its work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think gardening is sort of in at the moment,
Mm-hmm.
and so a lot of people think they want to do it until they actually figure out there's work to it. You know what I mean? It's a lot, and it's a commitment. And some people just don't have the time to commit. It's sort of like
Exactly.
exercising. It's a commitment.
Yeah.
But you gotta plot that time out. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. And our garden is under the National Park Service,
Mm-hmm.
so we have inspections to make sure that people are following the guidelines as
Mhm.
well. And so some people get a little upset about that, but I was on the board, as I told you, but at one time. But that's just the way you have to operate. It's the way the National Park Service
Mm-hmm.
wants you to operate. And if you fail the Park Service's standards, I guess they could ask us to leave.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
whole garden.
Yeah.
So you have to keep
Yeah.
it up.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard stories of that in other gardens too, and people would take on additional plots to keep it maintained, so they didn't.
And I think we've
Take
had that in our
over.
garden too, where people were halfway through the season and got sick or something happened, and others have just picked it up
Mm-hmm.
and kept it going and it's the same way with the tenant farmers.
Mm-hmm.
So the plot doesn't just
Yeah.
sit there and grass grows, and then the next year when, so-and-so comes back from back surgery, they've got
Yeah.
trees to dig out of their plot, or bushes, or
Yeah.
whatever has taken root,
Mm-hmm. So when you first moved, you moved here from Kentucky and you got your plot. Was there anything that, was there a learning curve in terms of trying to, grow different things, or did you just start kind of planting the same stuff, or?
I started out planting the same stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I found that didn't work because my plot has I don't know what it is, but for some reason I can't grow cucumbers or squash on my plot
At all.
at all. They grow, they look beautiful, they bloom, and then they die.
Hmm.
So that was one thing I've gotten used to, not doing that. One of the other things that's happened is work has gotten much more hectic and much more busy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a neighbor in my old building who was very interested in having a plot.
Mm-hmm.
So now she and I split the plot down the middle.
Okay.
She has one side, I have the other. And that was because the plot as a whole, I just didn't have the time to commit to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sort of worked out for both of us. She gets a plot, half a plot, and I don't have to take care of a full plot. So, and it also works out if one of us is away, the other one can take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the plots are 10 by 20,
Mm-hmm.
and that was just like I said, too much. I was starting to do travel
Mm-hmm.
and things with work, and it just got to be too much.
Yeah. So what's your plot neighbor's name?
Susanna Hurley.
Okay.
Um, and she's been out there probably 3 or 4 years with me.
Okay.
Um, and as I say, we have a board that lays in the middle. I'm on one side, she's on the other. But I've heard of other people who've tried to do it all together,
Mhm.
and that just doesn't work out.
What are some of the problems you've heard with that?
Well, the thing is, you're both doing the tomato plants, and one of you wants to come out and get their tomatoes and let them ripe for the salad,
Yeah.
and then you come out and the other partner's picked all the tomatoes, or, you know what I mean? It
Yeah.
just, or, you thought somebody was going to weed and they didn't,
Yeah.
and so it just works out if she does her half and I do my half,
Mhm.
and she grows stuff that I have no interest in.
Yeah.
She does a lot of parsley and cilantro and
Mhm.
things and mint that I could care less about.
Yeah.
But that gives her the freedom to do that,
Yeah.
you know.
So what do you prefer to grow? What are some of the main things?
Mainly now I have peppers and tomatoes growing. I have black-eyed peas growing. I just planted those like a month ago. I got rid of all my lettuce and stuff because it was just, with the heat.
Yeah.
I also had peas, and then I have my herbs. I have rosemary and sage, and summer savory,
Mm.
which I think is a German spice. I'm not sure, but I like it with tomatoes.
Mhm.
So I have that. And then I have a few flowers here and there because I think it brings the bees in,
Mhm.
just to bring them into the plot to pollinate.
Mm.
So that's mainly what I have.
Do you grow hot peppers or bell peppers? Or?
Well, I used to grow bell peppers, but now I mainly just do banana peppers,
Mhm.
the sweet bananas, because I found that's what I prefer to eat.
Yeah.
And the bell peppers, I really didn't use them as much as I thought I would,
Mhm. Mhm.
and they seemed to all turn at once.
Yeah.
And that was my big problem. It's like you didn't have any, and then all of a sudden you had bushels, So with the banana peppers, they sort of come along, so they're much easier for me to take care of and
Mhm.
to really use.
Mhm. So, do you remember some people that from your early days at Melvin Hayes, some of the more experienced people that were already there when you got there? Maybe they gave you some tips or.
One of the people I remember who's no longer there, she moved with her relatives in Michigan, was a lady called Sophie,
Mhm.
and she was a Holocaust survivor.
Mhm.
And Sophie was old. She didn't look like she could get up off of the ground, but she managed to get up and do her garden. She did her garden. But the thing I remember about Sophie is if she came out and something had eaten on her plants or something, her response was always, well, the animals were here first. So, and so I sort of adopted that attitude too.
Yeah.
I sort of overplant a bit because I compensate for
Mhm.
the realization there are going to be squirrels, there are going to be birds, there are going to
Mhm.
be raccoons or what have you.
Yeah.
And so Sophie is one person I remember from the garden. It was that attitude of, well, so be it,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And also the guy who took her place, Andy, who's now there, is a soil specialist with the Department of Agriculture.
Mhm.
And his garden looks like a weed bed. But it's not because he's going vetch and he's doing the whole green composting thing,
Mhm.
where you grow something and then you grow a cover crop and then turn it in.
Mhm.
And I tried to take that and do that once, but that was too much work.
Yeah.
It was digging all that stuff over
Yeah.
and, but he does very well with his vetch and, all his rye and wheat and
Mhm.
oats or whatever he grows in there. But and then Karen, who's next to me, who's now the president of the garden too,
Mhm.
she will always had such a neat little garden.
Mhm.
And then we have Angela, who's still in the garden, and she plants her plants in triangles,
Okay.
and it looks perfect. Everything is always perfect. So I
Alright.
was always impressed with Angela's ability to grow vegetables and flowers together and have it all look, like a display garden somewhere.
Yeah.
And those are the people around me that I really do remember. I didn't really. The garden is sort of like neighborhoods. It seems like you're in a section and you get to know the people around you.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you know a few at the other end and a few at the other end, but you're sort of your cluster you get to know.
Yeah.
And we have one lady, I think, who's probably in her 90s who's still gardening too.
Oh wow.
Which I'm impressed she's still out there, but
Yeah.
she's kicking along. So
All right.
in our little neighborhood.
So you said you used to serve on like the board, or what was their official position?
I was on the board as an adjunct member, and the only thing I did on the board, well, the big things I did on the board was I took on reorganizing the rules and regulations for the garden, because we had two sets. We had the national park regulations, and then we had some additional regulations for the garden, and they didn't they weren't always in sync. And so myself, Angela, and Loretta, who are also in the garden, took on that task, and we rewrote we could only rewrite our rules. We couldn't rewrite the National Park Service. So we rewrote our rules so that they were in sync with National Park. And then we also took a look at some of the rules that didn't make sense, like it was forbidden to grow spider plants in the garden.
What's a spider plant?
A spider plant is like a house plant. And we were like, and nobody in the garden, I've never seen them with a spider plant in the garden. So we struck that rule out. We couldn't figure that one out. But, and so we looked at the rules, and there were some old rules about the compost pile, which we've since gotten rid of. So we struck all those rules out. The garden apparently at one time had a common compost pile, but there was issues, and that was before I got there. There were issues with people putting wire and things in the compost, and then it really became a trash pile. It wasn't a compost pile.
Yeah.
So at one point, I guess the garden decided they weren't doing a common compost pile anymore. So that was my big contribution, I think, to the board when I was there. And then I also served on some of the days when they did inspections of the garden. We have inspections once a month. So I would help out with that. And then just sort of give my opinions and votes and things of the board. And, we seemed to have the same issues a lot when I was on the board. People wanting to plant roses, which are not allowed.
What's wrong with roses?
They're forbidden by the National Park Service. And I think the reason they're forbidden is because, roses require a lot of chemicals to really keep them up. Fungicides and pesticides. And it's an organic garden. So I think that was the reason for not allowing roses. And we actually had one person who planted a rose garden one time. I mean, they had 2/3 of their garden was a rose garden. So we had to deal with that. And that was they weren't happy that they had to take all the rose plants away, because I don't know what they did with them, but they had at least 15 rose plants.
Wow.
But if they had read the regulations, they would have realized that was a no-no.
Yeah.
And that has to do with National Park Service. So that was really my big contributions to the board was, and there were always situations where the board wanted opinions on how to handle a situation. So we would come to consensus on how to handle different, people can appeal to the board if they're being thrown out of the garden. And sometimes we would accept the appeals and sometimes we wouldn't. And a lot of times it depended on the history of the person with the board. If they had been a frequent violator, or that we tried to throw them out once before, you gave them another year. They didn't do any better the second year. It was sort of like, well, what's the point?
Yeah. How long did you serve on the board? How many years?
I was probably on the board at least 8 years, maybe more. It was interesting, and you learned a lot about the garden and the rules and regulations, which I think a lot of people don't really, I think they get them in the mail,
Mhm.
and they file them in the trash
Yeah.
or in the I'll look at that some other time
Yeah.
pile,
Yeah.
and that's why I say, like, the person who planted all the roses, they probably never read the regulations because
Mhm.
it's like regulation number 4. I mean, it's not. You know, it's not buried in the back. It's
Yeah.
front page.
Bold letters. Yeah.
Bold letters. Yeah.
So is it? I mean, is it a common thing to have people up for being kicked out, or is that most people?
I think most years, at most, we maybe have one.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very common, um, and most of the time, and a lot of times when we've decided to kick somebody out, it's because they failed to tell us they had moved, or
Hmm.
you know what I mean. We find out later they moved,
Mm.
and they just never bothered to tell the board
Yeah.
that they moved. That's probably 50%
Yeah.
of the kickouts we have, or you never get a response, so you never quite know what they thought.
Yeah.
And then you have the diehards. We had, you always had 3 or 4 people who were all you continuously had problems with them because they knew the proper way to do things, or that really wasn't a weed. It was it's like
Yeah.
get real,
Yeah.
Joe Pie is Joe. That's why it's called Joe Pie weed. It's not a.
What's the Joe Pie weed?
It's a well. I don't know if they have them here, but we had them in Kentucky. They
Yeah.
were like just a pesky weed that
Yeah.
serve no purpose. It's like get rid of it.
All right. S- how has the demographic of the garden changed since you were there in around '97 until now?
I guess again the well. I guess I think there's a lot more families than we used to have,
Mm.
but I think that's because the neighborhood has changed. I think there's a lot more people with children now
Okay.
in the neighborhood. Because I know when I lived at Sedgwick, there was maybe 1 or 2 families with children, and when I moved out, there must have been 7 or 8 families with children in the building.
Wow.
So I think it was that whole people moving back to the city, and so that's how it's changed. Um, I don't think the age demographics have really changed. It's still a mixture of younger and older.
Mm.
I think it's a little more stable now because, like I said, our list is so long. People, I think, have waited so long to get in.
Mm-hmm.
They're determined to stay.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? If you waited 4
Mhm.
years to get in,
Yeah.
you're determined to stay there. And it's a very nice garden. They provide the water, tools as far as like hoes and shovels, and
Mhm.
and hand tools you buy yourself.
Okay.
But so it's a very, I think the rate is like 25 a year or something.
Mhm.
It's reasonable.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think that's how it's changed. It's just a lot more children, a lot more families.
Yeah.
Um,
Has the racial demographic changed much, or?
Not really. It's always been somewhat of a mix, but I think it's a reflection of the neighborhood population.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if you don't live in the neighborhood, it's hard to garden there.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a few people who come from Adams Morgan
Mm-hmm.
to garden, but I mean, unless you either work in the neighborhood or live,
Yeah.
I mean, if the garden was somewhere else, I wouldn't do it
Yeah. Yeah.
because it would just be too much trouble to get in a car and go
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
you know. Um,
Yeah. Can you talk about the whole beneficial insect thing? I mean, do you recommend it? Are there some insects that you wish you got that you didn't, or I don't know much about it. I didn't.
Angela and Jerry have been doing the insect program.
Mm.
One of the things we did was we had a ban on beans one year because the bean beetle had gotten so out of control, and the wasps that feed on them,
Mm-hmm.
I think we just couldn't get enough of them in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
So we did bring that population down, but I think the beneficial insects work.
Mm-hmm.
I was a volunteer at the zoo probably 10 years ago. I had to quit that because of work, but with the horticulture program, And they actually do the beneficial insects too
Mm-hmm.
in the greenhouse because a lot of the plants they have go into the display so they can't use pesticides and things.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only thing we used was something called voltic oil,
Mm-hmm.
which is like an oil from a tree,
Mm-hmm.
and it somehow affects the insect's digestive system, but not animals.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the only thing we were allowed to use at the zoo. Um, but I think it really works. And I actually grow fennel in my garden because it's supposed to be a plant that's beneficial to the
Mm-hmm.
beneficial
Insects.
insects.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I do grow fennel. I also have dill growing because that's supposed to be another good plant for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another reason I have some of the flowers. I figure it probably brings in some of the beneficial insects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the program works. I know there are people upset because certain bugs don't have a counterpart to, like the bean beetle does.
Hmm.
Doesn't have an insect that will get rid of it. But you know what? You just have to learn to accept them or don't plant the stuff they like,
Okay.
Because
So-
I like the broccoli and cabbage and stuff, they have some sort of insect that attacks them. So I tend not to grow them.
Hmm.
I just sort of work with what I got.
So it's made it easier to grow some things, but then it's made it harder to grow other things. Is that kind of what?
Well, not necessarily harder. I think because we're organic and certain beetles and stuff don't have a beneficial insect to attack them,
Mm-hmm.
those insects sort of multiply
Yeah.
because we really have no way to get rid of them.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's made it easier to grow the beans
Yeah.
because the wasp that attacked the bean beetle. I mean, it used to be with the beans, I could put the beans out, come out, and it was like lace. My leaves were like lace, and that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
So I have noticed the difference between having the ban for 1 year on beans and then keeping up with the wasp.
Yeah.
So that's more of what I'm saying is that the harlequin bug, I think is the name of them.
Yeah.
I don't think they have like anything to fight them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just sort of attack the cabbage and broccoli and all of that stuff. But
Yeah.
like I said, my solution is don't plant it.
Yeah, I think we have the harlequin beetles that Mamie D. Lee too, but they're not really around when it's cooler. So some of that stuff, yeah, I don't plant during the summer months either.
Yeah, and apparently they're voracious on the cabbage and stuff, but I just don't plant it. I'm like,
Yeah,
don't plant it, you don't have a problem. But
yeah.
there are people who insist they have to have their broccoli and cabbage. I'm like, go for it.
So what do they try to cover it, or how do they get around it?
Some people try to cover it with the cloth that we talked about earlier. But I tried doing some of that stuff, but I just found it to be a pain.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it was more trouble than what it was worth. And especially with the farmers markets, I can go and get it at the farmers market. If I really want good fresh broccoli,
Yeah.
I can get it at the farmers market. I don't. Tomatoes are another story. I like having the tomatoes. I like having the peppers. I can just go out and get those. And plus, I have the varieties I want, not
Yeah.
the ones the market has.
Yeah.
But so that's sort of my thing. Is if I have to cover it up, I don't want to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. What farmers markets do you go to?
I go sometimes to the one at Van Ness, and then there's one at the church in Woodley Park on Saturday morning.
Mm-hmm.
It's a one-guy operation. He
Oh, wow.
parks in the church parking lot on Saturday morning. So I go there sometimes. He comes from Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And so I'll go there. And those are the two that I mainly go to.
Yeah.
And they're both within walking distance. Now that I'm working downtown, I may try and do some of the ones downtown during the week, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see. I've only been in there like a month or two, so.
Have you been to many of the other community gardens in town?
I haven't been to them. I've heard about them. I know there's a big one over behind the school on Wisconsin Avenue. Friendship. I think it's called Friendship. But I've driven by it, but I've never stopped.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some things on PBS about some of the other gardens, and they look interesting.
In DC, there's a PBS.
There, and Karen can tell you who it was.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lady who did a show on, not a show, a documentary on community gardens in D.C., and our garden was one of them she did.
Mm.
She did one that was purely, I believe, for a food bank,
Mm-hmm.
and and there was another one she did, I can't remember, but she interviewed people in the gardens and
Okay.
things. And I think I saw it on Channel 32 once,
Mm.
the Howard University channel.
Okay.
But I know I saw it at the library because she
Okay.
came in and showed it at the library.
Awesome. I'm gonna look for that.
Yeah, it was interesting, different approaches
Yeah.
and things.
So with the things that you told us that you grow earlier, I know you said you like to pair your tomatoes with your savory. And what other types of dishes do you have? Any specialties that you make, or things that you really like to prepare in a certain way? Or
Not really. I usually don't do a lot of preparation. I like things plain,
mm-hmm.
but I think one of my favorite things is just the peas out of the garden, just fresh out of the garden.
Mm-hmm.
The sugar snap peas,
Yeah.
just eating those as a finger food.
Yeah.
And I do the same with the banana peppers.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I really cook that's special is sometimes with the sage, I'll fry chicken,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll fry some butter with some sage leaves,
Mm-hmm.
and then pour that over the chicken.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I know it's not healthy,
Hey.
but it just gives it a very nice flavor.
Yeah.
You know, a little sage flavor, butter.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then I also like using the basil with the tomatoes as well as the
Mhm.
savory, and then the chicken with the rosemary. I also love just doing salads in the spring because they're so easy to grow,
Mm-hmm.
and just pairing them with whatever I
Yeah.
have on hand, or what looks good at the store.
Mm-hmm.
I just make different things every day and bring salads every day to work while I have the lettuce. So that's actually, the lettuce is probably my favorite thing out of the garden.
Do you grow a couple varieties, or?
I usually grow a red oak leaf,
Mm-hmm.
and black-seeded Simpson.
Mm-hmm.
I always grow black-seeded Simpson. And then I'll usually try one or two other things just to have some variety,
Mm-hmm.
like maybe a romaine or something. It's depending on the year.
Yeah.
And what's at the store,
Mm-hmm.
Or Johnny's Seeds. I buy a lot of stuff from Johnny's Seeds.
John, what is that?
Johnny's Seeds is a seed company in Maine,
Okay.
and they actually do some organic seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I buy stuff from there. I would recommend them to anybody. Everything I've ever gotten from them is very good. And I order online or on the catalog.
Mm-hmm.
And I've even ordered onion plants from them.
Mm-hmm.
And they came, and everything was fine.
Yeah.
So I have no qualms about ordering from Johnny's.
Do you get stuff from any other places locally, or is that your main?
Johnny's, and then locally I will go to Beinecke's in Potomac or American Plant Food on River Road.
Okay.
But the problems I have with those two places are, I think DC, the climate is different than the suburbs,
Mm-hmm.
and they cater a little more to the suburbs than the city. And I really, other than Johnson's, I don't know that there's any place that caters to, like when you buy your tomato plants, they keep giving you the dire warning they're going to die because you're buying them too early.
Yeah.
But that's not true, because in the city, the frost is over much earlier than, I'm not in Gaithersburg.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so they put up these red flags, or there's things you want that you can't get because they're not going to get them till people in Gaithersburg or Rockville can plant them.
Yeah.
And so you're sitting there with a blank space
Yeah.
until you can find
Yeah.
what you want. That's my main
Mm-hmm.
issue. But their plants are good quality, and I'm happy with stuff I buy. It's just the timing isn't always
Mhm.
what you would like, And they're convenient to me because You know, if I go to one, I just can drive down the road if they don't have it to the other and hope they have it. So that's the main reason I use them.
Yeah. So in terms of the Melvin Hayes, do you think that it's right now in a good position? Are there things that you wish were happening that aren't happening? What's your vision for the future of Melvin Hayes?
I think Melvin Hayes is in a good position. I know we've been threatened a few times with going away. One of them was the people in Tilden Gardens didn't like looking out at the gardens, so they wanted to get rid of them. But my philosophy is when they bought in, the gardens were there because they've been there since World War II. So unless they've been living in Tilden Gardens since World War II,
Yeah.
they saw the view when they bought.
They seem nice to me.
Yeah. Well, they apparently say it looks like trash and they don't like looking out at it. Which in the winter, it doesn't look the best. I mean, no garden looks perfect in the winter.
Yeah, true.
And the other time was the DC Fire Department was going to put up a temporary structure in the garden. They were wanting the Park Service to allow them while the fire station in Cleveland Park was closed. But that never came to fruition because I think enough people contacted the ANC to make a major stink about it. So that didn't happen. But I think financially and structurally, I think the garden's in a good position. I mean, the only problem we really have is the fence is old and a little falling apart at places and trees have fallen on pieces. So the fence needs some repairs. And then we've also had issues with the deer. And that's why you see the sticks with the netting at the top. I don't know if you noticed them or not when you go.
I didn't. I mean, I remember it's like a metal fence, right?
There's a metal fence at the bottom, but attached to the metal fence are like garden stakes with bird netting on top. And the reason we did that was apparently the deer can see the netting, and with deer, the issue isn't if they think they can jump it. If they see the barrier, they automatically stop. They don't judge how strong the barrier is.
Yeah.
So apparently the little fish netting, I mean, I think if a deer tried to jump it, they would just knock it all down.
Yeah.
But so we put that up a few years ago because there were a lot of problems with deer in the garden. And I don't think we've had problems since. But I never had problems with the deer, but people on the edges did because the deer would jump the fence. And as I told people, it was a smorgasbord out there for the deer. And by the time they got to me in the middle, they were full. They were ready to go. But I think, being on the board, I think it's in a good place. And as I said, the list is huge to get them in. Because I know Karen has mentioned some other gardens have called her to refer members to them because they don't have enough people. And I don't know if that's the case where you are, but we've never had that issue. I mean, I think if we had more space, it would be gone. It's very high in demand. And I know at one point the plots were split because they were 20 by 20. And I know when I was on the board, there was discussion about some plots trying to split them, some of the bigger, but I don't think anything ever happened of that, to get more people in the garden. But now that I'm not on the board, I don't know if that's even being considered. But like I said, 20 by 20 would have been big, but that's, I think, what they originally were. And then they split them in half as people left the garden, and now most people have 10 by 20 plots.
So it sounds like you go to a lot of farmers markets. You're gardening. You're pretty interested in some type of food movement. I mean, do you think that
I don't know if it's a food movement. It's just the way I've always, I guess, being rural. It's always the way it was. Do you know what I mean? To me, it wasn't a movement. It was always, fresh produce was always preferable to frozen or canned. Or
in terms of DC, do you think there's more access to that now than when you first got here?
Oh yeah, I think when I came here, I didn't know of any farmers markets. I guess it was maybe even the early 2000s before, or maybe late 90s, um, when there was a farmer who started coming up on Reno Road, one of the little triangles, he would just park there and sell. And that was the first farmer's market, other than Eastern Market, that I was aware of in D.C.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows about Eastern Market, so
Yeah,
that's not a secret.
yeah. um,
But yeah, because now we have Van Ness and the guy, like I say, at the church down the street. And I know about DuPont now and the courthouse in Arlington. And then working down, I used to work downtown, oh, God, 10, 15 years ago. And that, the farmers markets just started to come up at like Department of Agriculture and stuff when I was down there. So it's changed.
So do you have any? Well, it seems like there's a lot of people that are becoming more interested. Like you said, the waiting list for Melvin Hayes is longer.
Oh,
there's more community gardens around. I know you talked about before people not really understanding the time commitment it takes. Is there any other type of advice or recommendations that you might have for people that are interested?
Well, the other thing is, I think one of the problems with Melvin Hazen too is when you get in, you're not going to, and this is probably true of any garden, you're not going to get the best plot out there. So I guess just to be patient, work with what you got, and then maybe you can move to a better plot. We have a list where you can say, I want to move. You get on the list, and eventually you'll get a better plot. I was lucky in that I got a good plot to start with and was able to keep it. So I guess that's one of the words of advice is have patience. And also ask advice. I mean, God knows if you ask a question in Melvin Hazen, you've got 5 people ready to answer it. So, I mean, people are ready to give advice. So, don't be afraid to ask. And I guess one of my biggest problems with people in the Melvin Hazen too, being on the board, was things would happen and they wouldn't tell the board anything. And like I said, there'd be weeds all over. You don't know what happened. It turned out, they had to have a hip replacement or a knee replacement. And all they had to do was call the board and tell us, and we could have gotten somebody in to take care of that plot while they were gone.
Yeah.
And then they wouldn't have the burden of coming back to like this overgrown plot. That was my biggest frustration, is people not communicating with the board or being afraid to ask questions. So I guess, and the other thing is we had a few gardeners who were very inexperienced who took, and I don't know if they still offer it, but there used to be a Master Gardener program through the Department of Agriculture, and they offered it at UDC, and I think it was free.
Wow.
Or very little cost. But I don't know if that's still occurring or not.
Yeah.
But they would teach you how to garden and teach you the basics. And the library is another resource to always.
Yeah.
So I guess that's it. Communications and education is sort of, maybe educate yourself before you get the plot. Then you might.
Yeah, and having the time.
And reality, because I know people too who tried to do the French trenching. Do you know what that is? When you dig up all the soil and you replace it.
Okay.
And to me, that's not reality. It's like, improve the soil you got. Don't try to dig the whole plot. And then what are you going to do with the soil after you dig it? It's like, I don't know. That was one that I was just mystified by.
All right. So I think we covered quite a bit. Was there anything you feel like I missed in terms of stuff you remember, or you might have?
There's just one other thing. You asked me about people I remember. There was a lady there also when I started gardening called Pam Smith, and she was in the garden an hour or two every day. She finally had to give the garden up for health reasons, but she was a terrific gardener, and she used to go with me when I would go buy plants. So even after she left the garden, she and I would go, and she would still buy stuff for her balcony. But she was probably one of my favorite people in the garden, but she's since passed away. But um, her garden was perfect. And it was funny going to the garden places with her because I would just look at the plants and pick whatever. She had specific colors, specific breeds, specific,
Yeah.
she was one, and you do have that. You have people more like me who are just plant it, see what happens.
Yeah.
And you have people who have everything planned or some people keep logs.
Wow.
No, I couldn't keep a log. That would last for like 3 days and then I'd lose the log. But we have people who keep logs and notes every time they go to the garden. And so I think you just have a variety of experiences and different ways people do things. So, and of course with the internet wasn't quite what it was when I started the garden either. So now you've got that whole opportunity to get information and stuff. So that's about it, I guess. Was there anything else from you that?
I think we covered most of.
A lot of ground.
Yeah, unless there's any special soil improvement techniques or any special little gardening techniques that you do that.
Well, I do. Like I said, I do the dig in.
Yeah.
But also every year I try to get around 4 or 5 bags of organic material from the Home Depot or wherever, and just put it on the ground in March, or maybe even earlier, and just let it set there. The other thing I do is I start my spring garden March 15th, or around the 15th of March, which people think is too early.
Yeah.
But if you don't do your lettuces and radishes and things that early, then if you wait too long, you never get anything because the heat comes on. And about the time you're starting to get your lettuce, the heat hits it and it's goodbye. It starts to bolt and get bitter. But I've had very good luck with trying just around the 15th, somewhere in that range, the middle of March, try and get the lettuce, the radishes, the onions, the peas and all of that in. I mean, you don't want to put beans or any of that stuff in. It's too early. But the cool weather things, I've had very good luck doing that. So that's basically my tricks of the trade, are those two things. And I'm accused of not watering enough, but I think people water too much and they give themselves diseases and their plants diseases. Root rot, or they end up with a lot of slugs, and so I tend not to water probably as well as I should. So that's my other thing. I think people water too much, but that's my opinion. I'm sure they think they're just fine.
So I do actually have another question. Even in the last 3 years since I've been in DC, the weather's kind of been different every year. We had like
last year was brutal.
Yeah, and this year we had like 2 weeks of rain in July.
And my garden has done terrific. My garden is probably better than it's been in years this year. Last year it was a wash. I did water a lot last year, but the heat was so severe I just couldn't keep it going. And I actually had one tomato plant and I never had it. It bloomed and bloomed and bloomed and I never got a single tomato off the entire plant. And I kept it watered, I kept trying, but I think it was just the heat was just overwhelming. And the tomatoes I did get were probably about half the size I was used to on my pineapple tomato, which is the one I really like. It was probably half the size last year. Last year was brutal. And then it was wet last year too in the spring, and I had trouble getting things in the ground. And then, like you said, then it was dry and hot. And last year was just, I don't think anybody was a winner last year.
So how does that compare to, is there a noticeable difference from the last 5 years between like 97 and 2002? Is there...
I think this year is a little more normal to what I'm used to from the past years. Last year was totally abnormal. I just don't know what happened last year. It was all those 100-degree days. It just cooked it. The other thing is, I think I could have started a little earlier, but again, it was so wet. A lot of my stuff got out late. And then I think by the time the heat hit, it wasn't established as well as it should have been, and then the heat was so severe. But last year was, but the other years have been pretty much the same. Not that I mean, you always get some wet in the spring, you always get some heat in the summer, but not the brutal. I mean, last year was just brutal.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
year hasn't been bad for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I could barely get out to water last year some days.
Oh, and that's it. I mean, I would wait till 7:30 or 8 o'clock to water, and it was almost dark.
Yeah.
And then you go out there and everybody else was watering, so you have to wait your turn. And then you're like drenched, before you even get to the hose
Yeah.
because of the heat. And
Yeah.
it was just brutal. And I couldn't go out in the mornings because of my job. I have to, I have to be at work too early to really get out there. And plus, you don't want to be out there in your shirt and tie, watering, and then get,
Yeah.
a little bit of compost on you. You gotta go in and,
Yeah. It's funny.
change. So, but yeah, I haven't really noticed the climate change that much.
Yeah.
Just last year was the only year I really noticed it.
Alright. So, sounds like you plan on going on strong in the garden from here on out, and
As long as Susanna hangs in there with me, or I'll have to find another partner.
new partner. Yeah. Okay.
But she seems really happy out there, and she does very well. So, like I said, 4 or 5 years we've been out there together. So, and it's worked out well for both of us, I think.
All right. Well, cool. Well, if there's nothing else that
I
you
think
can
that's
think of,
it for me.
okay. Well, we can wrap it up here. So thanks a lot, Joe.
Well, thank you for coming by.
All right. Cool.
They did the produce and used it at